The amendment is considered as read. Is gentlelady having trouble with her microphone, or?
I think it's okay now.
There we go. Okay, gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I will be doing is I will be offering the amendment and then withdrawing it because I do not have the, at the end, because I do not have the requisite waiver. However, having said that, I would like to present the amendment and withdraw at its conclusion. So Amendment 171 seeks basically a Pacific War memorial at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Mr. Chair, this is a very unique situation in that there is a Rear Admiral, retired, by the name of Lloyd Joe Vasey, who served in World War II as a submarine officer aboard the USS Gunno under the command of John S. McCain, Jr., father of United States Senator John McCain III, and he's advocated for many years for the creation of the Pacific War Memorial at Pearl Harbor. In his own words, he says, there is no recognition of well over 150,000 brave Americans who were lost in the Pacific War. They are resting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean somewhere, or their remains are scattered across the South Pacific Islands. We need to honor them, and their family needs a place to mourn. Admiral Vasey turned 100 years old this year, and he has asked that something be done with his lifelong dream of having seen a war memorial, a little monument at Pearl Harbor so people could come and mourn those who we have not yet identified or found. To give you an idea of what Admiral Vasey is like, he tells the story about being on the submarine and then wondering, there's got to be a different and a better way. We cannot fight these kinds of wars. So he is actually the founder of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We all know it as CSIS. He has it in the Pacific, and it's called the Pacific Forum. And there have been many people who have gone through it as fellows because of his interest in peace. He clearly epitomizes what the greatest generation defines and means, and that all American service members who gave their lives is something that he does not forget, and he wants to see them memorialized, but more importantly than that, he wants the families to have closure. However, Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I do not have the waiver from the Natural Resources Committee, so with that, I will withdraw my amendment.
Gentlelady withdraws. Other amendments to this section of the bill? Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 1, consisting of amendments that have been worked out and approved by the minority led by Congresswoman Madeline Badallo of Guam.
Without objection, so ordered. If the clerk will distribute the amendments. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read, and the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
En bloc package number 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment 001 by Ms. Badallo requiring a briefing on the Guam Micronesian Kingfisher Recovery Habitat Memorandum of Agreement and specific impacts of that agreement. Amendment 002 by Ms. Badallo requiring the Department of Defense to develop guidance regarding the use of organic industrial base. Amendment 10 by Mr. Scott directs the Air Force to brief the committee on the status of the Advanced Adversarial Air Training Program. Amendment number 17 by Mr. Larson directs the Director of Defense Contract Management Agency to brief the committee on compliance with the Department of Defense Item Unique Identification Policy. Item 37R1 by Mr. Cook requires the Secretary of Defense to report on mutually beneficial infrastructure projects between military bases and local municipalities. Amendment number 38 by Mr. Schuster clarifies that nothing in the NDAA can be construed as authorizing a base realignment and closure round. Amendment number 40 by Ms. Badallo withholds 25% of funds of the Office of Secretary of the Navy until a request for proposal for a dry dock in the Western Pacific has been issued. Amendment number 47R1 by Ms. Songas authorizes the Secretary of the Army to sell and convey 3 plots of land in Massachusetts and use the proceeds to fund military family housing and other supporting facilities. Amendment number 106 by Mr. Kaufman directs the Secretary of Defense to provide a report on each military services existing process for stationing, basing, and laydown decisions. Amendment number 108 by Mr. Kaufman directs the Secretary of Defense to provide a briefing on the potential of using additional military installation ranges for counter unmanned aerial systems testing and training.
Is there further discussion on the en bloc package number 1? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Further amendments to this portion of the mark, gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to call en bloc package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the amendments, which are considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendments.
En bloc package number 2 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 48 by Ms. Songus requires the Secretary of Defense to provide a briefing on the Department's timeline and efforts to develop infrastructure master plans to support laboratory and research infrastructure requirements. Amendment number 54R1 by Ms. Shea Porter directs the Secretary of Defense to report to the Department of Defense efforts to develop joint minimum standards for commercial off-the-shelf equipment protective covers to improve readiness by preventing corrosion. Amendment number 122R1 by Mr. Rogers requires a report on the Army Contracting Command reachback functions. Amendment number 140R1 by Mr. Bishop directs the military departments to report on the amount of military base facilities used by contractors. Amendment 144R1 by Mr. Bishop extends the time for the multi-trades demonstration project through the year 2024. Amendment number 145 by Mr. Bishop improves existing biennial reporting requirements on core depot level maintenance and repair capabilities by clarifying what specific data should be included in such reports. Amendment number 190 by Mr. Swazi includes a report on the environmental restoration at active installations formerly utilized defense sites in past base realignment and closure locations. Amendment number 199 by Mr. Langevin requires a briefing on how the Department of Defense can leverage the smart city concept on military installations to improve readiness, delivery of services, infrastructure management, and installation physical and cyber security. Amendment number 253 by Ms. Cheney amends Section 2825 of H.R. 2810 to amend the transfer of Quebec-01 Missile Alert Facility to include previously agreed to provisions between the state and F.E. Warren that are laid out in the programmatic agreement. Amendment number 2258R1 by Mr. Khanna requires a cost-benefit analysis of Afghan military and security forces uniform specifications prior to entering into a contractual agreement.
Is there further debate on en bloc package number 2? If not, the question occurs on the amendments as offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina for further amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 3, consisting of amendments that have been worked out and approved by the minority under the leadership of the ranking member, Madeline Bardallo of Guam.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the en bloc package. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read, and the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized to explain the en bloc package.
En bloc package number 3 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 43R1 by Mr. Kelly modifies the boundary of the Shiloh National Military Park to establish Parker's Crossroads Battlefield. Amendment 55R1 by Ms. Shea Porter requires a briefing on whether the National Security Education Program and Language Flagship Program meet the Department of Defense requirements for language training. Amendment 80R1 by Mr. Knight requires a report on the Chase aircraft availability at NASA Armstrong Flight Research Center. Amendment number 117R1 by Mr. Rogers requires an annual report on the procurement and retirement of military working dogs. Amendment number 123 by Mr. Cook prohibits Type 1 highway glass beads from being used to mark the Department of Defense airfields. Amendment 131R1 by Ms. Davis requires annual briefings on Army's explosive ordnance disposal programs. Amendment 219R1 by Mr. O'Halloran requires a briefing from the Defense Logistics Agency on all agriculture-related equipment disposals for the past 5 years. Amendment 223R1 by Mr. Whitman requires a report on the aircrew training requirements for the fifth-generation weapon systems and advanced munitions, the Air Force Enterprise Range Plan, and Joint Airspace Range Training. Amendment number 290 by Mr. Brown allows the Navy to lease approximately 3 acres of land to the Naval Academy Alumni Association and the U.S. Naval Academy Foundation.
Further discussion on en bloc package number 3. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I don't understand what the glass bead issue is on military airfields. This would be Mr. Cook's amendment, prohibiting highway glass beads from being used to mark Department of Defense airfields. What's the problem here?
Sounds like an earmark.
Does the gentleman want to yield to somebody to describe it?
Colonel Cook.
Glass beads. Goes back a long ways in California. Originally, I ran a glass bead bill. Part of it was safety. Part of it was because the Type 3 were made in China. It was originally run as an environmental bill, just to educate you on this, because part of the problem with the Chinese bills, it wasn't as pure as the other ones. And there was a substance in that called arsenic. And as the roads, as I said, originally it was for transportation to mark the main lines. The arsenic would wear away, go into the soil. And this was a big issue in my area because of the water contamination by arsenic and chromium-6. You might have heard of Hinckley, California.
You mean Aaron's?
So I ran a bill, and the bill was taken away from me because Republicans did not run environmental bills. Okay, the bill was taken over, and it was actually passed. Okay, we go fast forward. I am concerned with this because I think the bill that the beads that are submitted there give more illumination, and the question is about where they are made. The ones they are made right now are in Austria. There is another part that goes into these other beads that they're recycled bills, that including some from China where they're all ground up. So it goes back all the way to a certain extent to my original concern about glass beads and how I got involved in that. Does that
Would the gentleman yield?
Pardon the expression. Does that illuminate the question for my colleague from California?
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I want to hone in on one thing. You're suggesting these are not made in America?
That's right.
Oh, then I'm with you, sir.
Thank you.
Any further discussion on en bloc package number 3? If not, the question is on the amendments offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Further amendments on this portion of the mark? Gentleman from Rhode Island?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the amendment on the computer.
And if the clerk will press send or whatever it is y'all do, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that I offer today that has the co-sponsorship of every one of my Democratic colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee will recognize that climate security is a fundamental part of our national security strategy. And we've studied a number of vectors for readiness on this committee, and but we often overlook this major multifaceted threat. Climate change, as we know, is real, and it can affect our readiness, both tactically and strategically. We know this because current and former military leaders agree. Secretary Mattis was correct when he stated, and I quote, "The effects of a changing climate, such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others, will impact our security situation," end quote. And, Mr. Chairman, I have a letter here from Admiral Stavridis who has spoken out on this issue, and it supports this amendment, and I'd like to enter that for the record if I could.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Chairman, naval bases such as Norfolk or Key West are already at risk for flooding, and that's just going to get worse as storm surges and rising tides increase in magnitude. So inland bases will experience other weather volatility such as extreme heat and wildfires, all of which can and do, in fact, impact their training capabilities. So thinking strategically, the changing climate will totally alter our joint battle space. So we've already seen display of dominance in the Arctic, where new sea lanes will connect continents more directly than ever before. Russia and other world powers recognize the value of this area, and we must be ready. So moreover, the changing global climate will lead to increased instability in the form of economic migration, increased competition over resources, and possibly more failed states, which we know to be breeding grounds for extremism and terrorism. Now, we know this because the leaders of the intelligence community as well have alerted us to this fact. They recognize that climate is a long-term threat, and we should as well. So my amendment is straightforward and simple. It instructs each service to assess the top 10 military installations likely to be impacted by climate change over the next 20 years. It also asks for combatant commanders to incorporate the effects of climate into their strategic battle plans. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, is a step in the right direction. I believe that we have to continue to be realistic and to explore the changing ways that a volatile climate will threaten the Department's mission. The truth is that the Department can study this on their own, as they have a wide berth when it comes to assessing threats to national security. But this amendment shows that Congress has the Department's back. It signals that we are not naive to the dangers of climate change or defense strategy, and it tells those researchers on the front lines of threat assessment that Congress will work with them, not in spite of them, as we together craft a sane and sober strategy to defend the United States from a variety of threats. So I believe that we absolutely have to ensure that the Department remains resilient and is prepared to address the effects of climate change on threat assessments, resources, and readiness, as well as to conduct operations both today and in the future. So with that, I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues for their support of and co-sponsorship of my amendment. I welcome the support and the comments of all of the members of the committee on this topic, and I urge everyone today to support its passage. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in Hampton Roads, Virginia, recurrent flooding is already, sadly, a fact of life. Sea level rise poses an existential threat to communities right outside of my district. and to those bases the communities contain. If anyone doubts me, I invite you to come down and visit our region. Local officials from both parties will gladly explain to you how much is at stake. In the Chesapeake Bay, Tangier Island is slowly disappearing. The city of Norfolk needs more than $1 billion to cope with just 1 foot of sea level rise, and scientists expect far larger increases than that. As everyone in this room knows, the entire Hampton Roads region is littered with military bases. Many of the most critical sit right on the coast, notably Naval Station Norfolk, Joint Base Langley Eustis, and Naval Air Station Oceana's Dam Neck Annex. Sea level rise endangers all of these installations. And again, rising waters are a fact of life in Hampton Roads. Over the last 80 years, the waters at Naval Station Norfolk have climbed more than 14 inches and counting. It is inconceivable to me that this committee would not want to better understand this looming threat and would want to take proactive steps to address it. Delay will affect capability and readiness at these coastal installations, eventually destroying the value of investments we've made over many decades. This amendment would give us a clearer picture of the exact challenges we face. It would require the Department of Defense to lay out potential solutions, giving us a roadmap for how to meet those challenges. In short, it would move us from passivity to active participation. Our military plans and trains every day for wars that, God willing, we'll never have to fight. We should prepare with equal vigor for the threats that we actually know we have to face. I thank my friend, the gentleman from Rhode Island, for his leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Songus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a co-sponsor of this amendment and strongly support its passage. Scientists tell us that climate change is real, is caused by human activity, and could have devastating effects across the globe.
Thank you.
It is a very real crisis that, if left untouched, will cause irreparable harm to current and future generations. Our military leaders, Secretary of Defense Mattis, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dunford, former Secretary of Defense Gates, have all testified to the risks that climate change poses to military readiness and our national security. This amendment is a common-sense addition to the National Defense Authorization Act. I thank Representative Langevin for his leadership, and I urge a yes vote. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Rosen.
Thank you. I want to say that we can debate the causes of climate change all day long, but nonetheless, climate change that challenges us to deal with the current and future issues that we have. The DoD must pay attention to the adverse potential effects of climate change, and as Secretary Mattis said, it really impacts us in the food and water in all of our agriculture areas. It's how it drives instability in the Middle East. The melting of the Arctic will thaw Russian ports. It will clear those northern sea lanes and drive increased resource extraction activity. And we also have to consider plans to respond to climate-driven disasters and the instability that they cause. As the weather gets warmer, droughts and famine will create more failed states. Former Secretary of the Air Force Deborah Lee James said in an interview, failed states are the natural breeding ground for terrorists. More countries, including our own, can be hit by droughts and famines. Governments can be destabilized and can pave the ways for the rise of dictators and dissolution of countries into lawless regions, similar to what we have in ISIS. What I want to say is that water really affects our agriculture here at home in very important ways. We can live without a lot of things, but we can't live without a safe, secure water grid. That means safe, secure drinking water and safe, secure farming within our borders. And if we don't also have that globally, we will have a worldwide crisis. For those reasons and so many more, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this should not be a partisan issue. The risks are too high. It is not just our oceans and ecosystems at risk, but our nation's security. Climate change is impacting all parts of the world in different ways. And as a military that has committed to and invested in maintaining a global presence, We must be prepared to protect our personnel and assets from the impacts of climate change, and this amendment does exactly that. In 2008, the National Intelligence Council found that over 30 military sites in the continental U.S. are already facing elevated risks because of sea level rise. In the western United States, drought has amplified the threat of wildfires, and floods have damaged roads, runways, and buildings on military bases. Last year in California, fires threatened Camp Pendleton as well as Vandenberg Air Force Base in my district. A year's worth of rain fell in 80 minutes at Fort Irwin in the Mojave Desert in California, causing $64 million in damage. There's no question climate change will increasingly impact our nation's military infrastructure here and abroad, ultimately making it more difficult to defend America's interests. Climate change will continue to pose a serious threat for the American people and the health of this nation. We must make the necessary investments to address climate change, as its impacts will increasingly disrupt our ability to carry out critical missions in defense of our country. And this amendment will not only help us further identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but also investments we must make within the department to protect it from the impacts of climate change. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Let's see, Mr. O'Halloran, did you want to? Okay, Ms. Bardallo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have heard from many senior officials that climate change is a national security issue. The report directed in this amendment will help to define the risks to our installations and identify potential mitigation efforts in the future. Climate change threatens our installations, particularly coastal installations where rising sea levels and threats of tidal flooding raise serious concerns. I certainly wouldn't want Guam to disappear. A recent study noted that tidal flooding events have increased fourfold since 1970, and conservative estimates forecast an increase of tenfold over the next 35 years. So climate change is holding many of our facilities at risk today, and this report will clearly detail which installations are at risk and potential mitigation efforts. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on Mr. Langevin's fact-finding amendment, and I yield back.
Chairman Bishop?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I am first grateful that we are no longer using paper. We're doing this electronically, because 4 of the 6 pages is rhetoric on this particular issue before you actually get to the report language. We would have cut down a lot of trees had we been passing out paper. But there is a line in the play 1776 about the Declaration of Independence, when Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island was also quoted as saying, "I have neither seen, heard, nor smelled an issue so dangerous it couldn't be talked about. Hell yes, I'm for debating anything." Whether the first 4 pages in here are accurate or not, there's nothing dangerous about talking about it. This asks for a report. I'll support the idea of having a report. I'll yield back.
I want to associate myself with Mr. Bishop's comments. Thank you.
Ms. Davis?
Thank you. I'll do the same, but I just wanted to point out that this is really a start. It wasn't an effort to look at the vulnerabilities across our military installations all over the world, but it was to select the top 10. And I think that's why this is a good start. It will be looking at mitigations as well. This is one of those issues that is sort of in that bucket that we ignore at our peril. And so moving forward, beginning this discussion we look at our installations is a worthwhile thing to do, and I appreciate my colleagues saying that.
Ms. Cheney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hate to disagree with Chairman Bishop, but I'm going to. I oppose this amendment strongly. We have heard testimony in front of this committee consistently about the array of imminent threats we face, about the extent to which the Russians, the Chinese, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, North Korea are presenting, in some cases, imminent threats to us as a nation.
And as these threats have grown, our own capabilities have diminished. We face a situation today in which our adversaries are developing weapon systems against which we may not be able to defend ourselves. And there is simply no way that you can argue that climate change is one of those threats. It's not even close. At a time of significant resource constraints, we simply cannot afford to instruct the Department of Defense to take their eye off the ball. There is no evidence that climate change causes war. If you look at the refugee flows that are often cited, for example, the refugee flows across Syria and Iraq are the greatest today. People are not leaving their homes because they're too hot. They're leaving their homes to escape ISIS and the regime. North Korea is not developing nuclear-tipped ICBMs because the climate's changing. Russia's not engaging in increasingly aggressive behavior against its neighbors and threatening NATO because it's too hot. ISIS and al-Qaeda aren't attacking the West because of the weather. At this moment of crisis for our military, particularly in the area of readiness, we on this committee have an obligation to do everything we can to begin to dig out of the hole we're in and to ensure maximum lethality for our forces. Declaring that climate change requires additional reporting from the Department of Defense makes that more, not less, difficult. We have to face our responsibilities and the threats with a clear-eyed determination, and I believe we should take steps on this committee that make it more possible for us to build the military that we all know we need to begin to rebuild. We shouldn't take steps that impose additional requirements based on political issues, and in my view, that's exactly what this one is. We have an obligation, in my view, to vote against this amendment and to ensure that we provide the resources our military needs to keep their eye on the ball, which is an array of complex and critical and in some cases imminent threats to the security of the nation, and climate change is not one of those. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
It's a little afraid of. Ms. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking in support of this amendment. When I was at the Department of Defense more than a decade ago, conversations about climate change's impact on our national security were already being had, and they were being had at the service staff level, at the combatant commands, and in OSD policy. And for a number of years, Secretaries of Defense of Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and numerous other uniformed defense leaders have identified climate change as a challenge to national security. In fact, Secretary Mattis has acknowledged that the effects of climate change, such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, and among others, impact our security situation. This amendment simply requires the assessment and report on the vulnerabilities to military installations and combatant commander requirements, things that they're already talking about over in the department. The department and Congress need to understand these impacts and integrate the responses in plans and in resourcing activities. I think we should value fact-based decision-making, and the effects of climate change are something that we deal with on a daily basis in Florida, and it has an effect on our economy and our way of life. So we can no more deny climate change's impact on our life in our state than we can deny its impact on our national security. So I think that I would request the support of my colleagues for this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
One could debate whether climate change is real or not. I think that's a debate that we don't need to get into, but to suggest that there is no connection between the changing climate and its effects on wars is incorrect. There are major conflicts now underway in areas where America has troops. You might take a look at the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Indus River. India and Pakistan are having a bit of a discussion about dams on the Indus River and the reduction in flows of that river as a result of climate change and the receding glaciers. Similar effects are occurring in the great rivers of China as a result of climate change and the recession of receding glaciers. You might want to take a look at the great Mekong River and the countries that are along and through which the Mekong River flows, and look at the debates that are going on now and the conflicts, not yet wars, but could become. And you only need to look at the environmental impacts of climate change with regard to food production to suggest that there is no relationship between food production or the lack of production and wars is to ignore the reality. Long before, or shortly before, there was a civil war in Syria, there was a serious reduction in agricultural production on two great river systems in that region, in part as a result of climate change, and certainly in part as a result of overuse of the aquifers in the area. You may want to consider Turkey's relationship with Syria and Iraq with regard to the rivers in that area. In fact, climate change does directly relate to war. Yield back.
Mr. Bridenstine.
Just like to make a quick comment here, associating myself with Mr. Bishop. I think it's important to note on this particular issue, there are real changes in the Arctic that do affect the Navy. The Arctic ice is disappearing. There's strategic changes that are being implicated here. And it's important for the Department of Defense to report to Congress on this. We're talking about a report here. And I would just like to associate myself with Mr. Bishop on this issue. It's just a report, and there are strategic implications that we need to be aware of.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you. I have to say that I live in a coastal state, and I think it's a very nonpartisan issue in New Hampshire that people recognize the impact that it's having. We do have streets that have water in them in the middle of the sunshine days, and we also have some installations, military installations, that are looking at this. This is a very real threat. And it isn't just Congress, although it is Congress's responsibility to do something about this, and I appreciate the fact that we're talking about a report. But Vice Admiral Lee Gunn, U.S. Navy retired, said, "The national security community is rightly worried about climate change because of the magnitude of its expected impacts around the globe, even in our own country. Climate change poses a clear and present danger to the United States of America. But if we respond appropriately, I believe we will enhance our security, not simply by averting the worst climate change impacts, but by spurring a new energy revolution." Those words give me hope, and I think we are responding appropriately. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Concluding comments from Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a quick question for the sponsor of the amendment for clarification purposes. On page 3, paragraph 8 says a 3-foot rise in sea levels will threaten the operations of more than 128 United States military sites. And the study that's called for at the end of the amendment says to DOD to look at threats within the next 20 years. So are you saying or predicting that there's going to be a 3-foot rise in the ocean in the next 20 years?
I'm not sure of the time frame for when that is, but that would be an assessment that DOD could include as they assess over the next 20 years what areas and what bases would be most affected within that time frame. I don't want to prejudge the data that they would use to make that calculation. I want this to be science-based, facts-based, and let them come to that determination and then look to what mitigating factors steps they would take in the event of what they anticipate based on science, what the outcome would need to do to change.
Okay, thank you. Reclaiming my time, I yield back.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Further amendments, gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 4, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, it is so ordered. The clerk will distribute the en bloc package, which, without objection, will be considered as read, and the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized to explain the amendment.
The en bloc package number 4 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 6 by Mr. Kelly requires a briefing on the Air Force's efforts to maximize undergraduate pilot training. Amendment 14R1 by Mr. Larson reinstates the Navy Mine Warfare Readiness Certification Program. Amendment 172R2 by Ms. Hanabusa requires a briefing on the history of the Accelerated Promotion Program and the Navy's considerations to enable the Accelerated Promotions retroactive between January 2016 and December 2016. Amendment 226R1 by Mr. Whitman requires a briefing on the potential use of water quality credits to comply with applicable federal and state laws and regulations to include the cost, benefits, and challenges associated. Amendment number 291 by Mr. Brown directs the designation of corrosive control and prevention executives for the military departments. Amendment 301R1 by Mr. Walsh requires that the National Guard flyovers of public events may only be flown as part of an approved training mission and makes the state or territory adjutant general the approval authority for the Guard flyovers in that state or territory.
Other discussion on en bloc package number 4? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendments are adopted. If there are no further amendments to this portion of the mark, chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move adoption of the report as amended.
Questions on the motion of the gentleman from South Carolina? Those are in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted. Committee will now receive the report of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and in consultation with the ranking member, we will postpone recorded votes on amendments to this particular portion of the mark until consideration of all amendments to this subcommittee's mark has concluded. Chair recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Military Personnel Subcommittee mark was adopted unanimously last week, reflecting the support and participation by all members of the subcommittee. The provisions adopted by the subcommittee and other military personnel-related provisions found in the full committee mark provide our warfighters, retirees, and their families necessary pay and benefits to sustain them in today's highly stressed force. To highlight just a few items, the subcommittee recommends increases in the end strengths for most of the military services, including the full unfunded requirement sought by the Chief of Staff of the United States Army of 10,000 more soldiers in the active component, 4,000 in the Army National Guard, and 3,000 in the Army Reserve. Recognizing the relentless demands of military life, we recommend a full 2.4% pay increase rather than the lesser amount recommended by the Department of Defense. In addition, we prohibit the reduction of hospital beds overseas to ensure troops and families continue to receive excellent medical care when hospitalized abroad, and include a provision that clarifies the role of the service surgeon generals in maintaining medical readiness in their respective military departments. We also included a provision to help military families defray the cost of a spouse obtaining a professional license in another state, and provide an extension of special pay and bonuses for service members designated to enhance retention in high-demand specialties like Air Force aviation. The mark would also improve support to those suffering from post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic brain injury by enhancing the process for consideration of discharge upgrades by the Military Review Board agencies, and ensures service members understand their rights related to applying for important VA benefits. Finally, the proposal would continue to refine sexual assault prevention and response by adding a new provision to the Uniform Code of Military Justice specifically prohibiting non-consensual sharing of intimate images, expanding special victims counsel training to include training on the unique challenges often faced by male victims, and clarifying the process by which a designated representative can be appointed for a victim prior to a court-martial. In conclusion, I want to thank Ranking Member Spear for her support, as well as other members of the subcommittee. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaufman and I enjoyed a very good working relationship this year, and I want to thank him as chair of the committee
for his efforts to make sure that we dealt with all the issues brought to me by my colleagues. The subcommittee mark includes provisions that will provide the military services flexibility to recruit and retain members of our armed forces and to continue our commitment to take care of military families. The mark includes the Private Act, which was authored by Congresswoman Martha McSally, and many of us joined in that effort to prohibit the wrongful broadcast or distribution of intimate visual images and ensure the military services have the tools to prosecute those that violate the law. This was the result of Marines United. The mark also provides support for victims of sexual assault by mandating training for Special Victims Counsel to recognize and address unique challenges often faced by male victims of sexual assault. The mark also continues the committee's emphasis on families by including $30 million for continued assistance to local education agencies and authorizes the reimbursement of spouses for state professional licenses and certifications when required to relocate to another state with their military member. The subcommittee continues to provide oversight of important programs by including in the mark reviews by the Comptroller General of the United States to ensure the morale, welfare, and recreation programs are properly funded to required levels and that the Department of Defense's debt collection practices are fair and do not place undue burden on service members and their families. I'm pleased the mark emphasizes the consideration of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury during review by the Board for Corrections of Military Records by codifying into law the requirement to review these cases with liberal consideration and requiring the boards to consider medical evidence in these cases from the VA and civilian health care providers. The mark also requires the Secretary of Defense to create a plan to notify service members how to donate to DoD's brain tissue repository in order to further TBI research. I'm concerned the subcommittee's mark increases the active Army by 10,000 soldiers and also includes significant increases for the reserve component. I recognize the Chief of Staff of the Army submitted an unfunded requirement for this increase. However, we still do not have a strategic plan from the Pentagon that would inform Congress how large the Army should grow or why. Further, by just adding funding to the NDA, this committee is not providing the stable, predictive funding the Army needs. The Chairman's mark will provide a 2.4% well-deserved pay raise for our servicemen and women, but this is above the President's request. Once again, the committee has increased funding to cover the $200 million increase, but where did it come from? I also hope we have the opportunity today to find the required offsets to fund an extension to the Special Survivors Indemnity Allowance to ensure it does not expire in May 2018. This falls short of my strong desire, as well as other members on this committee, to permanently fix the survivors' benefit compensation offset for receiving dependency and indemnity compensation. This offset amounts to a shameful tax on surviving spouses who, as widows, are already struggling emotionally and financially. While the SSIA extension would be an important temporary fix, I hope this committee can work with leadership in other committees to make a permanent fix to offset a priority for next year. Lastly, I want to acknowledge the outstanding staff who has worked with us in a bipartisan manner, including Craig Green, Dan Sinnott, David Giagetti, Andrew Peterson, and Danielle Stites. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Further discussion on the personnel portion of the mark? Are there amendments to this portion of the mark? Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up in block package number 1, consisting of amendments that have been worked out and approved with a minority.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the en bloc package, which, without objection, is considered as read. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized to explain the en bloc package.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. En bloc package number 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 5 by Ms. Bordallo, which directs DCA to provide briefings on Guam's commissaries, vendors. Amendment number 18R1 by Mr. Larson, which extends DFAS garnishment authority to include judgments for child abuse. Amendment 29R1 by Mr. Jones, a provision regarding hyperbaric oxygen therapy for certain members of the armed forces. Amendment 33 by Mr. Cook, which directs the establishment of a pilot program that provides job placement assistance and employment services to members of the National Guard and Reserves. Amendment 44R2 by Ms. Songus, which requires a briefing by the Office of the Secretary of Defense on the military services' ability to provide child care development services on military installations. Amendment 63 by Mr. Wilson, which works to stabilize military families in the event of a PCS that is not advantageous to work or school for the family. Amendment 66 by Mr. Scott, which changes the regular update for prescription drug pricing standard under TRICARE retail pharmacy program. Amendment 74 by Mr. O'Rourke, which requires a mental health examination for service members before they transition from military along with existing physical exam. Amendment 87 by Ms. Spear, which directs the Secretary of the Navy to revise a policy to make former dependents of members of the armed forces eligible for representation by a victim's legal counsel if the dependent was the victim of an alleged sex-related offense by a member of the armed forces. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Other discussion on block package number 1. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to speak on the en bloc amendments. As a grateful member of a military family, I know firsthand the challenges families face, and they regularly hear about this from the struggle of frequent relocations and prolonged deployments. As the former chairman of the Military Personnel Subcommittee and current chairman on the Readiness Subcommittee, I appreciate how critical the success and happiness of our military families are to troop readiness and retention. The Military Family Stability Amendment and the en bloc package supports military families by giving them a greater flexibility to plan for relocation. It grants families the option of remaining in their existing station for up to 6 months or relocate up to 6 months early of a permanent change of station. It further allows families to choose where to use their housing allowance. This amendment provides greater support to families with school-age children, allowing them to relocate at semester breaks rather than at the middle of the school year, and provides greater flexibility for the career or educational military spouses. I am grateful that increasing stability for military families by granting additional relocation flexibility is bipartisan. I'd particularly like to recognize Congresswoman Susan Davis for joining me in introducing this measure as a standalone bill last month, and of course the leadership now of Chairman Mike Kaufman. This measure is also supported by many military veterans service organizations and military family organizations, including the National Military Family Association, the Military Officers Association of America, the Military Child Education Coalition, Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Blue Star Families, the National Guard Association of the United States, and Veterans Support Foundation. Families are the backbone of our military. We should support them as they stand up for us. Mr. Chairman, I urge the passage of the en bloc amendments.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Further amendments to this subcommittee's mark. Gentlelady from California.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would extend the application of military selective service registration and conscription requirements to female citizens and U.S. residents between the ages of 18 and 26. It's nearly identical to the amendment that was approved by a vote of 32 to 30 during last year's markup. The only difference is a change to reflect the fact that the Secretary of Defense has now certified to Congress that all combat positions are open to qualified female candidates. Let me remind the committee of some of the key points from last year's debate. The sponsor of this amendment 1 year ago rightly described the draft as sexist. That is no less true today.
In 1981, the Supreme Court upheld the exclusion of women from selective service because the purpose of registration is to prepare a draft of combat troops. That ruling is no longer applicable, as qualified women are now eligible for combat positions. The position of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Chief of Staff of the Army remain unchanged. If you vote yes on this amendment, you're voting with both of them. CBO assesses that this amendment will reduce federal spending. Colleagues, as many said during last year's markup, this injustice is our responsibility to address. It's time to stop delaying the inevitable with studies and parliamentary gymnastics that undermine the will of the committee. I don't want to see daughters put in a place where they'll be drafted. I also don't want to see sons put in a place where they'll be drafted. I don't think any of us would want to see anyone's children put in a place where they'll be drafted. But if it does come to a draft, men and women should be treated equally. As my colleagues from Massachusetts, Ms. Songas noted last year, quote, gender equality is achieved when women and men enjoy the same rights, the same opportunities, and the same obligations across all sectors of society, and that includes military service, unquote. That remains as true today as it did a year ago, and I urge the committee to vote now as it did then. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
I yield to myself in opposition. We discussed this issue a year ago, and we have moved on. It is signed into law that there is a commission that has been appointed. It is operating. That is first looking at whether we need a draft or not. And secondly, if we do need a draft, who should be drafted? So that was the outcome of the conference agreement last year. That is in law. That is underway. And I think that is certainly what makes sense rather than rehashing past debates. Again, the first question is, and I don't know the answer to tell you the truth, whether we continue to need selective service or not. That's what this commission is looking at. And if it decides we do, then it is looking at who should be drafted. Obviously, any change to current law has to come back to us, but I think we have to ask first questions first, and that's what current law does. We ought to let it operate. Other comments on this? Ms. Songas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate that there is a commission in place, but as it's making its analysis, I think it's important to reiterate the important role that women should play. An analysis conducted for the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service estimated that only 29% of young people ages 17 to 24 meet eligibility criteria for military service, and that eligibility pool is pretty equally divided between men and women. Including women in the selective service system ensures that, in the very unlikely possibility that a draft becomes necessary, the full scope of the talents of all our citizens are available in our time of need. And given the nature of war today, women are virtually always in the fight. I have visited Iraq and Afghanistan a number of times, and while there, I have interacted with our talented servicewomen. These women have served side by side with their male counterparts. But it isn't just on the front lines that women are serving our country. At military installations across our country and the world, women are serving as military scientists, program managers, engineers, physicians, lab technicians, many other roles. As Representative Spear just mentioned, last year I said, and I reiterate today, gender equality is achieved when women and men enjoy the same rights, opportunities, and obligations across all sectors of society, including military service, and when different behaviors, aspirations, and needs of women and men are equally valued. Including women in the draft is a step toward equality, and Army Chief of Staff Mark Milley and Marine Commandant Robert Neller have both testified in support of women registering. This amendment passed this committee last year during markup with a bipartisan majority, and I urge my colleagues to support it again, and I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just remind people we're not talking about voluntary service in the military. As I think everybody on this committee and virtually every American thinks that our wives and daughters, if they decide that they want to serve the country in the military, should be allowed to serve in the military. You're talking about a draft. You're talking about forcing somebody
to go to war. That's what the selective service is used for. And so when I listen to all of these arguments on the other side, and I'm just, to be honest with you, Mr. Chairman, just baffled by them. You're not talking about whether or not a lady can serve. You're talking about whether or not a mother has to go to war during a time of a draft. I'm opposed to the amendment and look forward to voting against it.
If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. The noes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a roll call.
Gentlelady asked for a roll call vote. Is there support for roll call? There is. Further proceedings will be postponed. Further amendments on this section of the mark. Gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair,
have an amendment at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will rapidly distribute the amendment.
I was going to get to that.
Okay. Without objection, it is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would amend the current TRICARE system so we can ensure our service members are provided the same access to preventative health services as those insured under the Affordable Care Act, including preventative services, screenings for gestational diabetes with no copayment, smoking cessation, and over-the-counter drugs. It would create greater parity between the TRICARE program and the ACA requirements regarding free coverage for preventative health services. All preventative health care services provided under this new authority will be provided to beneficiaries free of charge. This statutory change will permit a more timely adoption of more preventative health care services and screenings consistent with evolving national trends for TRICARE beneficiaries. As new evidence-based preventative health care services become available, a delay currently occurs in providing these services to TRICARE beneficiaries if the law is not changed. Current law only allows for only specific preventative health care services and cancer screenings for TRICARE beneficiaries. This amendment would also cover child care through age 17, along with women preventative services and screening gestational diabetes. This amendment is about providing our service members with the same health services as those covered under the Affordable Care Act and that we as members of Congress enjoy today. Unfortunately, due to sequential referral issues, I will be withdrawing this amendment, but I look forward to debating it on the floor. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The amendment is withdrawn. Further amendments, gentlelady from California.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 4.6 million women who receive health care through the Department of Defense are not second-class citizens. Yet these women are currently receiving health care that is objectively inferior to civilian plans. Access to contraception is absolutely central to women's health and well-being, and the Department of Defense should not give servicewomen and their dependents fewer options than civilian women receive. Recent studies have shown that women in the military have a 60% higher rate, let me repeat that, a 60% higher rate of unplanned pregnancy than the general population. This has a negative effect on readiness, since nearly 10% of active duty servicewomen were unable to deploy as a result of pregnancy, according to a 2011 Department of Defense report. These disturbing statistics are a direct result of barriers to servicewomen's abilities to access contraception and family planning counseling. Under the ACA, civilian women are required to have access to FDA-approved contraception and counseling free of cost. However, some active duty service members and all non-active duty service members and military family dependents experience cost-related barriers to care depending on the type of contraception they use and if they fill their prescription outside of a military treatment facility.
For many of these women, getting to a base to access birth control is simply not possible. Now, inactive duty includes those service women who are on active duty but away for training, or who are having annual training, or who have been on active duty for less than 30 days. It also applies to all those in the reserves, National Guard, retirees, and military family dependents. Military families deserve access to all the tools necessary to make informed family planning decisions. That's why this amendment would bring TRICARE in line with the standard birth control coverage offered by civilian health insurance plans by removing cost-sharing requirements for birth control obtained through the mail-order pharmacy program or at a military treatment facility. It would also remove cost-sharing for contraceptive care, including insertion and removal of contraceptive methods like intrauterine devices. Service members and their families deserve the same level of care as civilians they fight to protect. It's only fair that we stand up for those who stand up and fight for our freedom daily. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield some time to Mr. Vesey from Texas.
Thank you, Representative Spear, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to offer my support for this very important amendment, and just want to echo what you talked about the importance of bringing TRICARE in line with standard birth control coverage offered by civilian health insurance plans. This is very important. I can't think of an issue that has probably been ignored as long as the issue of birth control and family planning has, and we've seen the devastating consequences of that. And by empowering women and empowering families to be able to have coverage and to be able to also have the opportunity to be offered, again, what is standard birth control coverage, I think is very important. We need to make sure that it happens, and we need to make sure that our service members and their families have the same level of coverage and care as the civilians do that protect, that they protect and that they fight for every day, that work for the federal government. And I urge the committee to accept this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time. Thank you, Representative Spear, for sharing some time with me.
All right, I now yield remaining time to Mr. Khanna from California.
Thank you, Representative Spear, and thank you for being a trailblazer and pioneer on issues of gender equality. As a new member of Congress, I found it appalling that military families don't have the same access to contraception as civilians. I would never have guessed that we still have this disparity. It seems to me just basic common sense that we should give those who fight and protect us the same access to contraception as those who are civilians. So I appreciate your leadership on this. Thank you.
All right, with the 32 seconds I have left, Mr. Carbajal, if you would like to also weigh in, I would give you that time.
Thank you, Ms. Spear. Clearly, service members and their families deserve the same level of coverage and care as the civilians that they fight for. The Spear Amendment would bring TRICARE in line with standard birth control coverage offered by civilian health insurance plans and removes cost sharing. It also removes cost sharing for contraceptive care in general. Ms. Spear, I just want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Time of the gentlelady's expired. Other discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While the intent is certainly good to have those that serve in the military and their families and others to deal with family planning, having spent a career in the armed forces and raised a family in the military, it's not completely foreign, these issues. However, I'm very concerned with language in the amendment, Mr. Chairman, because it talks about providing any method of contraception. If we look at equivalence to some of the plans that are covered in civilian health insurance and also other types of plans that could include abortifacients and counseling that may not be within Hyde Amendment language, I think that this amendment has major gaps in it, and for that reason, I urge my colleagues to vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Hartzler?
Sure. I guess I had a question. What is the cost of this? Do we have an estimate of how much increased cost is going to be for TRICARE?
The way we have framed this amendment, there is negligible cost.
how can, reclaim my time, how can there be a no cost if we're providing free contraception to all the family members now?
Well, first of all, if you're on a base, you're getting that anyway. This is if you're not on the base. And if you have an unintended pregnancy, the costs actually are much higher than if you offer birth control pills. So we only provide it in terms of generic or mail order.
I thought there was some other costs involved, but anyway, thank you. You're back.
Further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair of the noes have it, I guess.
I request it.
It's a close call.
It is.
Gentlelady from California asked for a recorded vote. There is support, and further proceedings will be postponed. Further amendments, a gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked out and approved with a minority.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the en bloc package. Without objection, it is considered as read, and the gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 30 by Mr. Jones, which directs a 1-year extension of pilot program for prescription drug acquisition cost parity in the TRICARE Pharmacy Benefits Program. Amendment 52R, Ms. Songus, which requires the Secretary of Defense briefing outlining service-wide efforts to increase the propensity of women to serve in the armed forces. Amendment 67 by Mr. Scott, provision regarding the establishment of ROTC cyber institutes at senior military colleges. Amendment 84R1 by Mr. Smith, which directs the Secretary to carry out a pilot program to provide health care assistance services to certain covered beneficiaries. Amendment 88R3 by Ms. Spear, which directs that if there is a military prosecution of an alleged sex-related offense, the Special Victims Counsel shall be entitled to a copy of all case information that is in possession of the prosecutor and is not privileged. Amendment 164 by Mr. Gallego, which directs the Secretary of the Army to establish a scholarship program at minority-serving institutions. Amendment 175 by Dr. Abraham, which directs the Secretary of Defense to submit a report outlining the process used to include para-health professionals in the MHS. Amendment 225 by Mr. Whitman, which grants permission to the Secretary of Transportation to designate covered training entities as centers of excellence for domestic and maritime workforce training and education. Amendment 261 by Mr. Canna, which authorizes the Armed Forces Retirement Home to lease excess property.
Okay, just to clarify, the amendment for Mr. Whitman is number 224 rather than anything else. All right, any
224.
Further discussion on the en bloc package number 2? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Further amendments on this section of the mark, Ms. Spear.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an issue that many of you have heard me speak about many times before. This is the issue of sexual assault in the military, where some 15,000 men and women each year are sexually assaulted. Only about 5,000 of them actually report it. Of those, only about 500 go to court-martial, and of those, only 250 are actually sentenced. Most recently, I was at our Air Force Academy and spent a lot of time with our cadets because the newest report that's come out suggests that it is prevalent in our academies as well. And at the Air Force Academy, for instance, 47% of the cadets experience sexual harassment. It's a pretty stunning statistic, and those are the individuals who will then go on to be our leaders. And if, in fact, we allow for sexual assault, sexual harassment to be acceptable in our academies, you can imagine what's going to happen in our forces. And we know the numbers of women joining the military is increasing. It's now about 20%. And again, the number of those who are sexually assaulted are, for the most part, men, I might add. Women just represent a higher percentage because of their numbers. So this amendment keeps the decision-making in the military. It doesn't take it out of the military. It makes the determination as to whether an investigation should move forward or a court-martial should move forward in the hands of the chief prosecutor in each of the services. Under the current system, commanding officers in the defendant's chain of command decide whether to prosecute criminal offenses. These commanders are not attorneys. Convening authorities receive only a few hours of legal training. The staff judge advocates who advise them are also typically not expert in military justice system. Most focus on administrative law, and any direct court-martial experience is years behind them. I've often heard that commanders must lead the efforts to combat sexual assault, and I couldn't agree more. What I hear less about is how the system prevents commanders from actually cracking down on sexual assault. And I want to share with you just a case that came down a few months ago in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. They threw out Airman Rodney Boyce's rape and assault conviction. And this was someone who was convicted in a court-martial. And it was thrown out because of the involvement of Lieutenant General Craig Franklin, who referred the case to court-martial. This all came about because in 2013, General Franklin was admonished by his superiors for tossing out the aggravated sexual assault conviction of a fellow F-16 pilot. But because Franklin was justly and correctly admonished for this abuse of power, the U.S. Court of Appeals found that his subsequent decision to move forward with the entirely separate Boyce case constituted unlawful command influence. This is made more ridiculous by two facts. First, the military judge during the actual trial found no evidence of unlawful command influence. Second, the appeals court that threw out the Boyce case also didn't find evidence of unlawful command influence, just the appearance of it. The Franklin case shows we have placed commanding officers in an impossible position. If they decline to press charges, they may be seen as favoring the defendant. If they learn from the experience and press charges on a subsequent case, that decision may be seen as unlawful command influence. This is a no-win scenario. It erodes trust in commanders and it erodes good order and discipline at a time when our nation faces significant threats abroad. This is not just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of national security. It's far past time for us to fix this system. Fixing the system keeps the decision-making in the military. The decisions to investigate or pursue a court-martial would just be determined by the person who is most equipped to do that, and that would be the prosecutor in each of the chief prosecutor in each of the services. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Ms. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Spears is right. This is an issue that we've dealt with many times before, and we've dealt with it correctly by enacting a number of reforms that have made a difference in the manner in which both sexual assault prevention is undertaken through training, sexual assault protection of victims through victims counsel and also additional training, but also prosecution. And one of the things that we did is we changed the chain of command process. So the manner that the issue that Ms. Spears is speaking about is actually not what we have today. In addition to our having removed Article 60, where
a commander could have actually overturned a decision from a, for a conviction. We've also changed the process by which these cases are reviewed and a recommendation for prosecution goes forward. Now, to give you just some statistics that relate to the Defense Department's annual report on sexual assault in fiscal year 16, commanders had sufficient evidence to take action against 64% of alleged offenders in sexual assault. Military commanders used the court-martial process to adjudicate 59% of allegations involving service members within their jurisdiction. These statistics clearly indicate that prosecutions are moving forward, and furthermore, it's been our understanding and others who have reviewed this that it's actually probably higher than what is actually occurring in the civilian courts. We have adopted a number of provisions with respect to this, including on a bipartisan basis having established the response systems panel that reviewed this issue for us for nearly a year, and they found no evidence to support removing the commander or that removing the commander would increase prosecutions. They did, however, recommend changes that we have undertaken, which again, this Congress did, and that totally revamped the process that a sexual assault claim goes forward. If a sexual assault case is reported, the law currently requires that the case be investigated by professional investigators who actually do have experience. Throughout the investigation, prosecutors are consulted on the type of evidence needed and any additional information required to make a determination. After their investigation is completed, it goes to the prosecutor, who is experienced and trained in sexual assault cases. And the lowest level at which decisions can be made about a sexual assault case is the 06 command level. It's actually referred up the chain of command. If the case is recommended for a court-martial, then goes to the next higher command for referral. And before a decision is made about referral, the commander and the commander's lawyer must agree. If there's a disagreement, and if the lawyers are recommending that the case go forward, but the commanders recommend that it does not, it goes all the way to the service secretary for review. So far, there are no cases that have had to go up that chain to the service secretary for disposition. Now, there's a number of reasons to leave it within the chain of command, obviously, which include the commander's responsibility, the fact they do have prevention responsibilities, that they have cohesion, also in issues where we have the combat environment. But the main issue I think that we must review this on is that there is no need for it. The other aspect is that this would consolidate basically in the Pentagon a huge funnel of all of these cases and would result in time delays that we don't have time for, both these victims and the need for a commander to have morale in their unit require quick action, the action that we currently have in place. Now, not all of the provisions that we have adopted over the last 5 years have been have yet come to fruition for us to show their impact, and some of them are still even in the process of being implemented from the 2017 NDAA. But this is not needed. It would be disruptive, and it certainly does not help the victims of sexual assault. I yield back.
Ms. Tsongas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congresswoman Spear for continuing to raise this very important issue that obviously merits the attention she has brought to it. Congressman Turner is so right. This committee has worked on a bipartisan basis, and I commend him for all his significant leadership in that area, to make a number of changes over the years to how the military addresses the scourge of sexual assault in its ranks, making sure that every victim of military sexual assault receives an attorney, making sure jury verdicts can't be overturned, and ensuring that those who are convicted of sexual assault will absolutely be processed for discharge. There's no place for those who are convicted of sexual assault in the military. These changes give the military and its leaders additional tools and resources to demonstrate that when these crimes occur, justice is served. However, there are still many worthy questions that deserve our attention, such as, should a commander have the authority to make the final decision on whether a criminal case should proceed to trial? Will that change have a significant impact on the military's ability to confront and eliminate this all too pervasive crime? Ultimately, we have to get this right. This is a multifaceted challenge, and it requires efforts on all fronts, and I think we all agree that by itself, simply changing a commander's authority will not get rid of the scourge of military sexual assault. And yet, in an institution defined by the chain of command and the dictates of deference inherent in that command structure, Commanders have played a crucial role. We need a change from a culture that too often, or often enough, allows a general to be promoted after he perpetuates a toxic military culture that accepts harassment and criminal behavior as the norm. And I should say he or she. A change from a culture where service members can be more afraid of their fellow soldiers than they are of the enemy. And we have all heard such stories. And we need a change in an organization when last year DOD estimated that nearly 15,000 active duty service members experienced a sexual assault in the prior year. Military commanders must understand how key they are to changing this culture and held accountable when they do not serve the interests of decency, professionalism, and justice. I do have concerns over how this particular amendment would be logistically implemented and what collateral consequences there might be for the UCMJ, where many changes have recently been absorbed. However, I feel this amendment is timely and sends an important message that we need to continue the conversation about commander authority, and I will support its passage. I look forward to continuing to work with Congresswoman Spear and the many others who've taken such an active role in this very serious issue, and others and looking forward to examine the full scope of the impact of this proposed amendment. But I do thank Congresswoman Spear for raising this important issue, and I yield back.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We hear stories. We hear phrases like the norm. We all agree that in sexual harassment cases or sexual crimes, one incident is too many. We would all agree with those statements. But here's the truth. The trend in the last 7 years is down, not up. But that is not the case in the general public at large. The programs are also sound and implemented by current leaders that often face the greatest criticism. Tools such as SHARP and SAPR not only have statistically proven effective, they bear great scrutiny for the same. When we see university statistics by comparison to our military academies, who, Mr. Chairman, one statement was that these are our future leaders, as if somehow they were flawed and broken in the production of those leaders. The NCAA and university statistics by comparison are 36% worse. Worse. What does that mean? That means that the general public at large ought to be knocking on the doors of our service academies and asking them how they are doing such a fantastically better job. Still, one incident is too many. But it's not because it's broken or the military somehow doesn't have a handle on it, or that commanders and the Uniform Code of Military Justice is somehow in need of being fixed. The importance of commanders' queries, 15-6 investigations, IG investigations, criminal investigative division investigations, and the like, are paramount to all commanders and the tools that they possess. I've used those tools as a commander at various levels in the various organizations that I commanded, to include sending people to prison for sexual crimes. To suggest that because commanders have these tools that they will somehow not be capable of using the Uniform Code of Military Justice to bring justice and good order and discipline in the military is absolutely absurd. Once again, what we see, Mr. Chairman, is an attempt to move the military away from its own separate justice system. One more chip, one more knock, one more crack, so that commanders no longer have the ability to establish good order and discipline in their organizations. If staff judge advocates, Mr. Chairman, as one statement was made, are not experts in the UCMJ, then my goodness, who is? After all, they go to school specifically and are legally trained specifically to understand the Uniform Code of Military Justice. One anecdote with service academies, meaning maybe they can't handle it and they should refer these to outside sources, outside prosecutors, impartial prosecutors, and the like. 3 dozen referrals were made to magistrates and only one was accepted. And all of the others were sent back to that service academy. So obviously they were doing such an unjust and terrible job that they couldn't be trusted Taking away commander's authority, that is exactly what we do not need. Why would we take away authority that is 36% better at our service academies than our colleges and universities? And why would we take away authority where we see the military as an institution who usually discovers its own problems, investigates them, exposes them to the media, demonstrates what their corrective programs are? You would never see these types of actions, and certainly not in so quick a fashion as you see in the military, out in the civilian community. What we don't need is unnecessary congressional interference in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Oversight, yes. Hearings, yes. What we don't need, though, is to break what is a better performing uniform code and a better set of standards. And I urge my colleagues not only to oppose this amendment, but to stand with commanders and the military. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to everyone who has spoken on this issue, because it has been a long time that we've been working with it, and frustrating, and just about every other thing I could say, because we all want to get to the same place. I remember one day going up to Camp Pendleton to speak to the commander there, and we were focused specifically on this issue and what was happening, and in the course of my sitting there, he got a phone call. It was another case that had just been referred to him, and he had already had one that day. So I was certainly convinced of the problem. There was no question about that. But I also know that in working hard, we began to develop better partnerships, and I think Mr. Turner spoke to this, so that there's much more discussion, there's certainly a consciousness, but beyond that, some way so that all the stakeholders are part of the solution. I also saw the changes that came about as I spoke to particularly women on bases that a special counsel has had on their ability to understand the system. There still are problems with this, but for many, at least they know what their rights are and that somebody can be there and stand in for them as well. That's made a big difference. What did concern me in all of these discussions that we had was a sense from many of our judge advocates that they actually pushed not to go to trial more than a commander, because the commanders had more passion, more concern. They knew the people that were involved, and they wanted to make that happen. And unfortunately, folks who, you know, really good at what they did, didn't have that same interest, really, because it could be that they would have a number of cases of he said, she said, in many cases he said, she said, and that in those cases that it would be too difficult to get any agreement, to get, you know, a conviction, and so therefore they tended to stay away from them. But commanders, not all, we had bad apples in this, we all acknowledge that, and there still are, I'm sure, but at least those commanders really wanted to see that case resolved. So I'm glad that we took the actions that we did. I've always held out that I'm willing to go forward. I think that this is a different way of looking at it, and I greatly appreciate my colleague, Ms. Spear, and all the people, all the women on both sides of the aisle particularly got involved in this issue, because we heard from too many cases. When I go to stand down in San Diego and I ask for all the women to come join me in a tent and talk about their issues, you know, last time we met, I probably had 25 women. They all came to the tent to talk about this. It is still a problem, but I haven't, you know, I do believe that we really have the solution at hand in the ability of people to interface on this, and we need to continue to work very hard on it. So at this point, I'm going to decline to support it, but I'm certainly there and looking at these issues, and I will continue to do that and continue to talk to people in the field. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Oklahoma and in my opposition to this amendment, and yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I
want to thank Susan Davis for her comments. We have spent a significant amount of time on this, and it's one because we're very concerned about this issue as a whole. This proposal does not fix the problem of sexual assault. It actually makes the issue of prosecution more difficult. Now, since the 107th Congress, this is a list of everything that we have passed as the House Armed Services Committee that has become law, single-spaced, page after page of reforms of the process to make sexual assault prosecution and prevention easier and more effective. Now, we did have concerns when we looked at the issue of chain of command on bias, coercion, unprofessionalism, and rights of the victim. We, for rights of the victim, gave the special legal counsel, as Ms. Davis said, to the victims, and then we gave the special legal counsel representing the victims standing in court. And contrary to how it's been described, the commander does not have a decision. That is by themselves. Again, to go over what we've done, if a commander and their lawyer agree, it goes forward. If the commander and the lawyer do not agree, then it goes to the next level for review. But there's never an instance where a commander on his own just makes a decision that this is not going to be reviewed, or it's not going to be referred for prosecution if there's disagreement. And if there is, it goes all the way to the Secretary of the Service Branch. Now, what this provision would require is that it actually be sent to chief prosecutors for each service, which are basically 3 lawyers. There are 6,000 cases per year. So we would have a determination on these 6,000 cases by these 3 service branch lawyers, rather than how we're doing it now, which is it includes the commander, it includes lawyers, it includes a review of actually the case and whether it needs to go forward. But we have been absolutely dedicated to protecting the victims and to trying to address the issue of sexual assault. We can't use the excuse that sexual assaults are still continuing for every amendment that comes forward. We actually referred this whole issue to a bipartisan panel, and they came back and told us, do not do this. So at a minimum, if we're ever to the point where we question what we have done, and so far everything it appears in all the data as to what we've done is working, the answer would be for us to give it to those who know more, not merely have a 30-minute debate here and then change the entire prosecution system within the Department of Defense. But again, at this point, as Ms. Davis had said, what we've done is working. What is in place is what has been recommended to us, and this amendment is not only, I think, detrimental to the overall process, but it certainly doesn't go to the heart of everything that we're trying to do and try to help victims, make the process work, bring prosecutions forward, and have people actually be brought to justice. I yield back.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to associate with myself with the comments of my colleague, Ms. Davis, and I appreciate the work of Ms. Spear, and we partner on many things together related to women in the military, but as the only female veteran over here who's dealt with these issues in many capacities to include in the chain of command, I would urge our colleagues to not support this. As was said by many of our colleagues, there have been a lot of improvements over the last years, and ultimately we need the chain of command more responsible, not less responsible, more engaged, not less engaged. We may need to have less Neanderthals in chains of command at different times and approaching cultural issues, but this structural change is not what is needed. It needs to stay as it is, so I appreciate that, and I yield back my time and urge people to vote no.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep my comments short. I served nearly 30 years in the Air Force, 5-time commander, and we want to respect that chain of command. We want to respect the commander. No one cares more about those units, their units, the morale, welfare, and discipline of those units than the commander. My experience has been when, in one of the units that I took over, had a very high rate of assault when I came in. We worked hard to use the court-martial, and we drove down those rates. And as Ms. Davis said, there were cases where it was like 50-50, hard to know what the verdict was when you, as a commander, but we went to court-martial anyway. And more often than not, got a conviction or the person pled guilty. We want commanders to be the central part of this, making these decisions with lawyers advising. We don't want lawyers making these decisions with commanders advising. And Mr. Chairman, thanks again for the chance to comment. I oppose the amendment and encourage this committee to do so.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman, I also will be brief. I'm one of the few people who's been a district attorney and a city prosecutor, a professional prosecutor, and has also commanded at the battalion and brigade levels. And I can tell you, as being both a district attorney and being inside of a grand jury and seeing what is referred and what is not referred, or what gets an indictment and what is true billed or not, no true billed, I can tell you that military commanders, for the most part, are uniquely qualified to be able to do that and decide what is best for the military order and discipline of their unit. The second part of that is I've seen an evolution of the Judge Advocate General, the JAG Corps, and their ability and their access with and to commanders, and their ability to inform them and to be a part of everything that they do, so that when these commanders make decisions, they're basing it on sound legal guidance, the same kind that I would get from a district attorney. I think it's important to note that CID or professional investigators do this every step of the way. I don't think the system is broke. I think we can always get better at everything we do, Mr. Chairman, but I think it is critical that we not take commanders out of this process. It is detrimental to the good order of military order and discipline to take access from the commander away, because this only happens at the 06 level and above with legal counsel every step of the way. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments to this subcommittee mark, Ms. Spear.
I have an amendment at the desk.
If the clerk would distribute the amendment without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Generally, the court-martial jury must be comprised entirely of commissioned officers whom account for only 11% of the Defense Department's total. Charges are levied by a commander acting as the convening authority, who also personally selects the members of the court-martial panel who will try the accused. The convening authority selects members who, in, quote, his opinion, are best qualified for the duty by reason of age, education, training, experience, length of service, and judicial temperament, unquote. This often results in judges having a greater impact on a case by selecting jurors they know instead of a more random sample. The military should follow the civilian structure and implement a random, balanced process to select the jury pool for each trial, with the caveat that members hold a higher rank. This would remove the commander's hand from the jury box and eliminate conflict and bias, as well as the specter of unlawful command influence. This would also expand the universe of potential jurors to all service members, not just senior members, which judges can select from. I understand that certain personnel serve in critical roles, that in those cases commanders could be provided authority to excuse individuals from the jury pool whose current tasks are crucial to the overall mission of the command and must not be interrupted by the court-martial process. This is another situation where we should attempt to align the military justice system with the civilian one. And I might just add here that the Uniform Code of Military Justice was created by the Congress of the United States. We just want to make sure that service members have the same level of justice as a person in the civilian world. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've had a little bit of experience with this, not as an attorney, but as both a soldier and as a commander. I actually testified in a court-martial that ultimately put a lieutenant colonel in prison and stripped him of all ranks, all retirements, all decorations, and all privileges having worn the uniform. I also sat on 2 war crimes tribunals as a member of a panel, as well as other types of tribunal or other types of courts-martial. And so what I would suggest is the fact that a convening authority, oftentimes someone in the equivalent of 3 stars of rank, especially when they are very serious cases, they may even go higher than that. The selection for such panels, it errs in favor of justice and impartiality rather than erring in favor of
some unit or chain of command. Let me illustrate. In one of the war crimes that I sat in on as a panel member, it was an enlisted soldier. Another in the same incident was an officer. For the enlisted soldier, the panel was composed of 12, which is no shock. 6 of them were officers, all commanders, all that had extensive combat experience. The enlisted soldiers, all in the rank of sergeant major, which is the highest enlisted grade, were all combat experienced, and they all sat in judgment bringing those things to bear because the particular incident was dealing with a war crime. You would not get that with a random selection. You would not get something that could be so impartial. It included male, female, and like the military, it included people from every stripe and every color and everything else. Why? Because we're all Americans and we all serve together. And so I disregard, Mr. Chairman, this notion that somehow, because military convening authorities are in authority, that they are incapable. They're just not competent. We break glass and we, drag them out when we need to fight something or fix something or break something. But my goodness, they probably don't know how to write. They don't know how to speak. They can't, put 2 and 2 together. They can't put a good panel together. They can't do any. By the time they get to the furthest levels, you would hope that they probably could do that. And I would suggest not only do they do that, they do it with great skill. Many times, we have this Hollywood notion of Jack Nicholson stepping up, and all of these things have gone awry and gone wrong, and we can't get to the truth. But the truth is, the most trusted institution in the United States of America is our military, bar none. Now, I've had a little experience with that. I went from the most trusted institution in the United States to the most despised. I happen to be the same person. And what I would tell you is that we have no grave concerns about the military being able to put fair and impartial panels together for the most serious of crimes. Sometimes they convene, sometimes with this many members, that many members, 6 members, maybe you get 12, depending on what level. It may go to a major general, it may go to a 3-star, it may go all the way up. Maybe the secretary has an interest in it himself. But what you won't see is a lack of concern on the cases that are serious. And again, I go back, Mr. Chairman, honestly, I didn't know that I was such a knuckle dragger, that I was so close-minded, that I was a rapist, that I was a murderer, that I was a sexual assaulter, that I were all of these things until I came to Congress and often heard from my colleagues how horrible I was when I was in uniform as a commander and how incapable I was in being able to do justice and make decisions. But now I've learned that maybe I just didn't realize who I was. What I would suggest is that, once again, we do not break the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is the glue that holds our discipline and good order together. And the last illustration I'll give you, Mr. Chairman, is as a field commander in an incident where a soldier tried to kill his NCO with his own battle rifle. I had the tools as a commander to immediately send him in irons, and he was sent away, and he was sent to prison. And all of that was handled by a chain of command, and it was done with a court-martial dealing in such grave and serious issues. Do not break the UCMJ. Oppose the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for his service. I'd like to yield my time to Ms. Spear.
Thank you for yielding me your time. Mr. Russell, I too thank you for your service to this country. The one thing I don't like is to have my words twisted. And with all due respect to you, I have not said that you are a rapist or that you cannot conduct yourself in an appropriate manner as a commanding officer. What this amendment does is quite simple. It just says that when a jury is being impaneled, they would be randomly selected from the universe of those who are eligible to serve on the panel, not
specifically handpicked by the convening authority. If we're really all about justice, we want to make sure that everyone is going to have the sense that these are those who are appropriately selected and that they're random. This would be like a judge in every jury trial handpicking those who would serve on the jury. And I must say that we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice is not a perfect body of laws. We have been amending it. We amended it through the Privacy Act. We have amended it because the convening authority had extraordinary power before where they could overturn a court-martial just because they wanted to. And we changed that Article 60. There's elements of the Uniform Code that could be fair and more equitable. This is one that would just say, let's randomize it. Let's not have the convening authority actually pick the panel themselves. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Turner.
Well, this is not just a quite simple provision. And it's also something that we have dealt with before. In fact, in last year's NDAA, we did take action with respect to the eligibility to sit on court-martial panels. But this is a solution looking for a problem where there's not a problem. We've not had anything before us as a committee that says there's a problem with the juries. But where we saw that there might be an administrative issue, we did take action. But even so, we didn't just stop there. We actually looked to the Joint Service Committee, which are made up of experts in military justice. They actually researched this issue on random jury selection, and they found no benefit. In fact, they also found that it would be detrimental for a number of reasons. One, there is a standing principle in the military that no member shall sit in judgment of an accused who outranks them. So there's no sense of a bias there of the individuals that they're reviewing. We would have to need to eliminate that firmly rooted requirement, and it would upend the structure of the military. Another issue is that to go completely random, you're going to end up with more junior enlisted, and perhaps rather than the expertise that you need for some of these provisions where the commander has an understanding of the subject matter and then can select those who sit based on that. You also get those who perhaps have very little military experience or perhaps legal understanding of the issues that are before them. The other thing is that in deployed environments, it would get rid of the ability of the commander to take into consideration key personnel at various times. So people could get jury service or jury selection at a time when the commander needs them. So we have no evidence or anything before us that indicates at all, and even the author of the amendment didn't cite any problem with the jury selection process. We have a report that this committee has from the Joint Service Committee that says do not do this, and we have some standing principles of the military that would be affected by it. This is an amendment that should be rejected.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just briefly state again, my experience with being in command 5 times, we have very qualified juries. They are experienced. They're often commanders in their own right, but outside of the same organizations of the victim or the perpetrator, but typically very well experienced and folks that you would trust. If we take this amendment, I believe that we'll actually go backwards. We'll have less experienced people. I think the confidence in the juries will go down, and we'll end up with a worse system. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman, again, just very briefly, I feel like I'm uniquely qualified. We don't have random juries in the civilian world. We're guaranteed in the Constitution the right to a fair and impartial trial in front of a fair and impartial jury. In the civilian world, as a district attorney, when I did a trial, we did a voir dire, and we determined who was qualified to serve and who wasn't, who had biases, or who had prejudices in which they couldn't serve fairly, or who had information about it which they could not set aside and only rule on the evidence which was in front of them, not the evidence which they may have heard through the grapevine. I think it is imperative that we not have random juries. I think that we get the best qualified who are not biased, who are not who are impartial,
Mr.
who are not
Chairman,
partial.
will yield for a question?
And in that case, no, not right now. And I think it's important
that we have commanders pick juries, or that juries are selected from a panel who are qualified and who have unique capabilities in order to rule the right way, not by a jury of random people who may or may not have bias. Now, I think a commander should never be allowed, just like in the civilian world, you cannot remove people for prejudicial reasons or for sex or all those other things. You cannot do that. Batson takes care of that. And so if you see those things, I think obviously you want to take care of that commander for doing the wrong things, or that panel. But you don't see that. That's not the question. The question is random versus a selected jury, and we have a voir dire process in the civilian world, and I yield now.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask the gentleman, if it's appropriate, Mr. Chairman, or maybe I should go through you. Would the gentleman tell me if the voir dire process is available under the UMJI? UCMJI.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I'll answer. It actually was. Thank you for asking that question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was in my notes and I forgot to mention it. It is.
I yield to Mr. Turner. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McEachin, are you good, or do you want to be recognized?
I'd like to be recognized, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate my good friend's comments and respect his body of knowledge, but I am not completely sure that I understand the logic behind the comparison between the military justice court and a civilian court. If both courts have voir dire, then both courts have the ability to weed out folks with prejudices, biases, and the like. And so I am not. It is lost upon me why one court should have a specialized jury and the other court should have a randomized jury. In my experience, which is admittedly all civil and some criminal, but mostly civil, you put a jury in the box, you ask them the questions that are designed to elicit prejudices, you strike those who have those prejudices, and you put on your case. I'm not sure I understand why the military should be any different.
Well, gentlemen, yield.
I'll yield.
Yeah, the issue of voir dire is actually a positive why we shouldn't make the change, because the defense has an ability to object. The aspect of this as to why it's different is because the structure is different. You know, the military is custodial of its membership. And so it's not like the random public, which is why you would want a random jury in our processes in civilian court. I mean, it is an organization, and it's an institution where it has its own judicial system within it. And that's why it's different in many respects. And again, this was reviewed. This was researched. They looked at this issue to determine whether or not the current system should be kept in place. And the research came back and said, keep it in place. It makes a difference. It actually enhances the judicial process. We have no information before us at all that contradicts that. We have nothing that says there's a problem with jury selection. There's a problem with justice on either side, both defendants or those who are victims. And again, we've now given victims their own counsel that have their own standing in court. It's completely unheard of that a victim would have their own attorney and be able to be present in court and have standing. In none of the issues that we have had have there been raised the issue of the jury itself. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
I can be brief. And first off, I just want to say I'm going to oppose the amendment, but just make a point of principle. It was said that earlier that we should not touch the UMCJ. It's sacrosanct and so on, but it isn't. It isn't sacrosanct. We've amended it more than a few times over the last 15 years, and we'll do it more than a few times over the next 15 years. So the debate that is taking place on the policy side is positive, but I don't think we should get trapped by the issue of whether we should, as a general rule, adopt whether or not we should amend the UMCJ, because we have, and we will in the future. The final point I want to make, and this is with exception to the gentleman's point from Oklahoma, how he went from one of the most revered institution in America, the military, to one of the most despised. I want to remind him he's not in the Senate yet. And with that, I yield back.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. So members in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's estimated that there are more than...
Does Gentlelady wish to offer?
Oh, I am offering.
Gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, it is considered as read. And now the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's estimated that there are more than 30,000 food insecure service members and their families in the United States. The barrier to accessing SNAP caused by counting our basic housing allowance, a basic allowance for housing, what we know as BA, as income has led many military families across the country to turn in desperation to food pantries and food banks, many operating on base or near military installations for emergency food assistance. For example, just in San Diego, there are 4 different emergency food distribution programs that operate on bases at the Marine Corps Camp Pendleton, which serves the needs of our military families stationed there. And I can tell you that just about every station in town has covered this story from time to time because it garners much publicity, and we get many calls saying, why isn't Congress doing something about this? Our families, once again, do not have access to SNAP benefits because their basic allowance for housing is factored into the calculation for this benefit. In other words, into their income. And this is inconsistent with a number of other government programs and calculations. The IRS, for example, lists BA as one of the tax-exempt military allowances not considered as earned income when determining eligibility for the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, that we know as WIC, for Head Start, and other federal assistance programs. So quite honestly, I mean, this is a really unacceptable situation, and I was looking forward to debating how we could work together to end food insecurity among our service members and take some possible actions today. But unfortunately, that discussion isn't going to take place because the Agriculture Committee has refused to waive their jurisdiction on this issue. I will reluctantly withdraw my amendment, and the debate over...
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yeah.
Before you withdraw.
I'm happy if you want to give us the waiver.
Probably not going to happen. The problem we've got, Ms. Davis, is that this pits SNAP benefits, which everyone agrees to, with increased TRICARE costs. And so linking those two together, in my mind, is not the right way to go. I will commit with you that when we do reauthorize the Farm Bill and actually have an opportunity to address this specific issue, I will commit to work with you on that during that time frame. But I can't let it happen now because of the objection I have to pitting increased costs of TRICARE to everybody for these valuable benefits that our service members can get if we can get that done. So while I refuse to waive jurisdiction at this point, I will commit to work with you on this issue.
Thank you very much, and I will take you at your word. And we have an audience, and I look forward to working with you on this issue because, quite honestly, it is very painful. And I know that it affects so many of our families. So I will withdraw, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll be here again. Thank you.
Gentlelady withdraws. Further amendments. Gentleman from Minnesota, whom we are glad to welcome back to the committee, at least temporarily, but hopefully longer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk, and in order to not overstay my welcome, I'll be withdrawing it.
What a good start.
Yeah.
The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. It is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the committee. This issue is one, and I am glad to be back with all of you and know the hard work you do. This is an issue that you have addressed partially in this NDAA, and it deals with how we treat our reserve and guard forces. I think many of you know I've made that a passion over the last decade to make sure that we have moved our reserve and guard forces to parity in terms of what's asked of them in deployments. They performed admirably right alongside many of you in the active forces. The issue at hand here is how they're called up under Title 10. It's the 12304B issue. This committee has taken a big bite out of fixing this with the TRICARE piece. I'm grateful for that. But as you all know, if you are called to duty, as my hometown unit in Mankato, Minnesota just returned
from a deployment over the past year in the Sinai. They were called up under involuntary call-up under 12304B authority, which means they are prohibited from receiving the benefits they would receive if they were called up under a normal chain. It's simply, it's an unequal treatment. They're not in it for the money. I know all those arguments. These are troops that would do it no matter what to defend this nation. But we have a responsibility. If we're going to have an operational Guard and Reserve, we need to treat them the same way when it comes to the benefits when they put themselves and their families out there. So I know the issue here is the pay for. I am cognizant of that. We have fixed the TRICARE piece for those families in this, and for that I say thank you. But going forward, we do need to address this, get this fixed, and I know all of you here want to do that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman withdraws.
I withdraw the amendment.
His amendment. Further amendments? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up in block number 3, consisting of amendments that have all been worked out and approved with a minority.
Without objection, it is so ordered. If the clerk will distribute en bloc package number 3. Without objection, it is considered as read, and the gentleman from Colorado is recognized to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, en bloc package number 3 is comprised of the following. Amendment 65 by Mr. Jones, which sets up an advisory board for military commissions and exchanges. Amendment 82 by Mr. Brady, which directs the GAO to conduct a study which evaluates the different way each military service conducts data on the race and gender of those convicted of violations of the UCMJ. Amendment 102 by Ms. Spear, which directs the Secretary of Defense to submit to the committees on armed services a report on DOD personnel policies regarding members of the armed forces infected with HIV. Amendment 149 R1 by Mr. Vesey, which directs the Secretary of Defense to brief HASC on availability of certified financial planners to service members at the onset of the new blended retirement system. Amendment 191 by Dr. Winstrup, which directs residency requirements for pediatrists. Amendment 284 by Mr. Thornberry, which creates a Defense Public Service Medal to be awarded by the Congress. Amendment 287 by Mr. Carbajal, which is a sense of Congress regarding the National Guard's Youth Challenge Program. That's it, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question occurs on, gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the Department of Defense, less than 30% of the U.S. youth qualify for military service, either because of poor physical health, criminal record, or the lack of a high school degree. Each year, 1.3 million kids drop out of high school, severely affecting their local communities and the greater U.S. economy. The National Guard Youth Challenge Program works to fix or avoid all 3 of these issues. The Youth Challenge Program, YCP, such as the Grizzly Youth Academy, is one of the most effective youth development programs for high school age students that have dropped out or are at risk of dropping out of school. The National Guard Youth Challenge Program provides the DoD an opportunity to work with states and local governments to engage our nation's youth. The goal of the Youth Challenge Program is to improve the life skills and employment potential of participants by providing military-based training, a high school degree, high physical fitness standards, and assistance with family concerns that could result in legal troubles. I appreciate the committee working with me to include my amendment, bringing attention to this important program. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Other discussion on en bloc package number 3? If not, the question is on the amendments offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Moving on, further amendments. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my intent to introduce and withdraw this amendment. I would like to begin by thanking Congressman Bilirakis and Congressman Sanford Bishop from the House Veterans Affairs Committee for their work on the concurrent receipt issue. Currently, there are approximately 550,000 military retirees that are eligible to receive both military retired pay and VA disability compensation, but they are prohibited from doing so under the current guidelines of the program. This means that more than 500,000 veterans are being taxed for having the courage and unwavering sacrifice to serve the country. And so as we debate the necessity of enhancing our military readiness after a decade of military degradation, let us not forget that the most important resource we have are the men and women in uniform. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to introduce into the record a letter from the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States in support of the amendment.
Without objection.
And I would yield such time as he may consume to Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Chairman, I thank my colleague from Florida for his amendment and his work on this very important issue. There are over 50,000 veterans in my district in southwest Alabama, and this is an issue I hear from veterans about quite often. This is also an issue that has bipartisan support. We need to ensure that those who serve our country receive all the benefits they earned. We should not allow bureaucratic regulations to punish our veterans who have given so much to our country. Mr. Chairman, I understand there are some budgetary issues that must be addressed, but I hope the committee can work with the gentleman from Florida and the rest of us to find a solution to this issue. And I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to echo my colleagues in expressing the urgent need to address this issue of concurrent receipts of earned veteran benefits. This committee understands the profound sacrifices that our nation asks of our men and women in uniform. In return, we promise them fair care and just compensation for their service, as well as for any service-connected injury. Yet nearly 500,000 veterans have been cheated out of the benefits they earn simply because of outdated policies prohibiting concurrent receipt of unrelated benefit payments. This amendment would bring an immediate end to this clear injustice. It has been widely endorsed by the VSOs and deserves our strong support. While we won't be able to pass today, as a Marine Corps veteran, I look forward to working with members of both parties to get this critical legislation across the finish line. It just makes sense. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida withdraws the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next amendment, gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and in full disclosure, I am going to withdraw this amendment, but I think this is an important issue for everybody to
If the gentlelady will suspend, if the clerk will distribute the amendment without objections, considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized.
In last year's NDAA, we created a two-fee structure system for TRICARE enrollment fees. We created one for future serving retirees and those electing TRICARE Select, like a PPO, and we created another for currently serving and current retirees in TRICARE Prime. As we continue to try to limit burdensome redundant systems, we now see that this was a mistake that will force the Department of Defense to maintain a two-fee structure system for the next approximately 50 years, until the last person who comes in the military on 31 December 2017 becomes eligible for Medicare. My amendment will repeal the grandfather clause so all retiree benefits are on the same fee schedule. It will change the index change the index to this fee schedule from a COLA to the national health expenditures, but it would delay any enrollment fee increase until 90 days after the GAO report that is due the 1st of February 2020 to verify, etc. Active duty and their family members, Chapter 61 retirees and surviving spouses still do not pay any enrollment fee. The DoD supports this change. It was a legislative proposal of theirs with the budget submission, and it will save the DoD approximately $32 million in mandatory and $10 billion in discretionary over 10 years. The DoD also estimates changing from COLA to the national health national health expenditures. Sorry, I just lost my place. That will save $61 million in fiscal year 19 and $400 million over 5 years. We can't just look at savings for the department because it must be fair and just for our retirees. And this is really where, the rubber kind of meets the road. In 1994, a military retiree paid approximately 25% share of his or her health care. Currently, a retiree, and you might be thinking about what this percentage is, from 25% a share in 94, a retiree today pays approximately 8%. This amendment will bring it to 10%. It's estimated that the increase would be from $47 a month to $58 a month for a family. And in my estimation, that's fair and it's just. This grandfather clause is further predicated on the misguided assumption that our past retirees have seen more combat than our future retirees, and thus should pay less at the cost of the future generation. I would love to believe that the world will be at peace, but at this point, I think that seems aspirational. Of the 1,145,634 retirees under the age of 65, 425,910 deployed in support of CENTCOM contingency operations. Our future retirees deserve equal consideration and treatment as our past retirees. And in addition to that, the savings to our country, both in terms of eliminating a redundant system and in savings, are too large to ignore. However, this is one of those issues that we really want to bring all the stakeholders on board. We're not there yet. We're going to try and get there. And I certainly encourage all of you to continue to think about this issue. But for the meantime, I'm going to withdraw it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady withdraws. Okay, we're doing pretty well. According to my notes, we may have 9 or 10 more amendments in personnel, and then we've got Strat, and then we've got full committee. So we can do this. Everybody go vote, stretch your legs, and then come back for a big push to get done this evening, hopefully earlier than usual. Committee stands in recess.